Well, originally, Israel stated that the aim was to neutralise Iran's nuclear threat. But the longer that these attacks have gone on, it's become clear that it's really more than that.
They were at the negotiating table. They were taking part in diplomacy when all of this happened. They feel like in many ways they were duped.
Do you think there's also a risk of the international community losing sight of the starvation and bombardment happening in Gaza at the moment because of this crisis? Good morning, Bonnie.
Hi, Bridie.
And good morning, Patrick.
Morning, Bridie.
We are watching an extraordinary escalation in the Middle East. Israel targeted Iran's nuclear and military bases first, but it has quickly changed and we are seeing a rising civilian death toll on both sides. How did we get to this point, Bonnie?
So over the past more than a year, lots of things have been changing in the Middle East. And I think we're kind of at a very unusual place. So what's happened is that Iran's power in the region has long rested on its allies and proxies. For example, the Assad regime in Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and the Houthis in Yemen. But really, since October 7, there's been a shift in the power in the region. Assad is gone, and Syria's new leader is looking to Washington rather than Tehran. The Houthis have reached an agreement with the US. Hezbollah is leaderless, after the attacks from Israel last year, and Hamas's leadership also is wiped out as a result of the war in Gaza. So that's the kind of political situation. But also last year, Iran sent some missiles and drones into Israel, and Israel's response was to basically cripple Iran's air defense system. So there's a kind of military aspect to what's happened as well. And I think last week, Netanyahu saw a window of opportunity, really, because the US were about to sit down with Iran and they had some talks scheduled on Sunday. And I think, he wanted to act quite decisively before then. And he saw a weakened Iran and he saw a chance for Israel to go after the nuclear capabilities there.
Look, I think that's a pretty accurate summary of where we're at now, but you could even go back a lot further. You can go all the way back to the Iranian Revolution in 1979. This has been brewing for a very long time. It was 2002 when Western intelligence services first revealed that Iran was working on nuclear enrichment. There's been a lot of rhetoric from both sides. There's been threats from Iranian leaders to wipe Israel off the map. So there's a very long history of this, and a lot of these things are now coming into alignment in which Netanyahu and the Israeli military feels like they're able to undertake this attack.
Also, I think Trump's withdrawal from the nuclear deal in 2018 is a big part of what's happened.
So what is Israel's actual aim here?
Well, originally, Israel stated that the aim was to neutralise Iran's nuclear threat. But the longer that these attacks have gone on, it's become clear that it's really more than that. A correspondent, Peter Beaumont, who's a former Middle East correspondent, has written about, Israel seems to be or could potentially be pursuing a broader agenda than just destroying the nuclear program. Israel struck at police headquarters, the Revolutionary Guard, Intelligence Directorate, the state television broadcaster. Those aren't nuclear enrichment sites. And so, it seems like the aims of this are broadening, and we don't really know where that will end. What are we looking at? Something that could resemble regime change, or at some point does this stop, and is Iran able to kind of regroup and accelerate its plans?
I think there's also probably a domestic element to it as well for Netanyahu in Israel. He's holding together a pretty tenuous coalition of far right extremists plus his own party. As I said, this has been a very long-held goal from him to cripple or destroy Iran's nuclear program. There's a number of elements involved here.
You mentioned regime change. That has been discussed in headlines and in media and even from Netanyahu. What could be the possible consequences of forcing a regime change in Iran this way?
It's very unpredictable. There's no kind of crystal ball that we can see into what would happen if the leadership of the Ayatollah was removed, if the leadership of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards was removed. All we know is it would be incredibly dangerous and incredibly unpredictable, I think.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Macron's been talking about that, hasn't he? And he said, when you topple a government, and you have no idea what comes next, you're kind of walking towards chaos. And I think we have the examples from Iraq and Libya, when there was no plan for a kind of day after, there was no coherent government in waiting on the sidelines. That could be quite a terrifying prospect.
And what about the people of Iran? Do we know what they want?
I think views, as in any country, are mixed. But for a long time, the Iranian regime has been very repressive. There have been concerns about human rights, about women's rights. But also, paradoxically, there's been this kind of rally round the flag effect where people in Iran actually are supporting the government now because they don't want attacks that threaten their families, that their livelihoods, their society. They support regime change in many cases, but don't see this as the way it can be achieved.
There's a big Trump factor here, as mentioned, even going all the way back to 2018. This is a story that's changing quite quickly, but the latest comments as we record from him is that he's given Iran an ultimatum and has said he has ideas about what he wants to do, but likes to make up his mind at the very last second. I know this is a really difficult question, but is there any insight into his strategy or aims during this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating question, isn't it? And I think everyone's been really trying to read the tea leaves over the last few days. So in terms of what we know about his strategy, look, it's not clear, and it's not clear that he has a strategy. In the last 24 hours, he said, nobody knows what I'm going to do, and one of his allies have said the president is in deal-making mode. So he hasn't come down on one side or the other. But what's clear at the moment, I think, is that the US wants to keep its options open, and it wants to exert maximum pressure on Tehran. We understand this through the fact that the US has moved some Air Force refueling aircraft closer to the Middle East in the past few days, and they could be used to refuel B-2s, which are these very large planes that carry bunker-busting bombs. Obviously, Israel is hoping that the US will use those against Fordow, which is the nuclear enrichment facility that's built deep inside a mountain in Iran. So there are those signs, but then also we've had, the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who was at the G7 with Trump, insisting that the US is not going to join the bombing campaign. So we're kind of in a bit of a holding pattern when it comes to Trump's strategy, but there's an interesting situation unfolding inside Washington, which is, obviously there's lots of pressure from from Israel and kind of traditional Republican hawks, and also the evangelical right for the US to get involved. And kind of finish the job in Iran. But then, the MAGA Republicans are really against intervention and don't want the US to get dragged into a kind of a costly and potentially lengthy foreign war. So
I think that division within the Republicans kind of mirrors what Donald Trump is going through. You've got that MAGA element who don't want to get involved in, and Donald Trump, came to power essentially when he came down that kind of gilded escalator, and the moment everyone remembers. One of his first things he said is that we've wasted too much blood and treasure in costly entanglements in the Middle East, and I'm going to stop that. So it's kind of core to what he represents. But on the other hand, you've got traditional Republicans, famously John McCain, who was a presidential candidate, and during when he was up against Obama, sung that bomb, 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 bomb Iran to the tune of the Beach Boys' Barbara Ann. He said it was a joke at the time, but it does kind of give away what, part of the Republican base has always believed, that Iran is a threat not just to Israel but to the US, and that they should take military action against Iran.
I should mention, actually, we're also seeing some steps towards some potential, diplomacy is happening as well. So it's not that we're on a kind of, one track to the US bombing Iran. There are potential off-ramps.
Yes, we will get to those as well. This conflict has huge consequences, obviously, in the Middle East, but the ramifications ripple around the world. Australia is not a major player in this, but we can feel the effects of it, can't we? Like, what are the potential consequences for Australia in all of this?
I think the government's primary focus at the moment is on the safety of Australians in the Middle East. There are around 1,500 Australians in Israel. There are around 1,000 Australians in Iran, both of groups have registered with DFAT, the Department of Foreign Affairs, to try and get out of those countries. But they have been consistently questioned about what their approach to it is. Penny Wong was on Insiders on Sunday and was asked about it, and started off with the statement that Israel has a right to defend itself, which was controversial in the time. And there's been an op-ed which we published from Ben Saul questioning that, which we can get into. But, I think consistently they've also been talking about both sides taking a step back and de-escalating the situation and returning to diplomacy, which I think the Iranians would find somewhat frustrating, because they, as the Iranian foreign minister told Christine Amanpour, overnight, they were at the negotiating table. They were taking part in diplomacy when all of this, happened. They feel like in many ways they were duped over this. They entered talks only to, essentially have Israel take immediate action, when it got to the 60-day mark.
Just on that right for Israel to defend itself, is that principle being correctly applied in this situation?
Look, I think that is Israel's justification, obviously. However, it's not clear that this attack could be justified under the kind of imminent threat doctrine of international law. But it does also, this question about whether it's justified under international law also feels a little bit redundant in the context of what is going on in the Middle East at the moment. But look, certainly, if we look back to the piece that we published from Ben Saul earlier this week in The Guardian, there's not great levels of justification for a preemptive attack in this manner. Iran has been failing, according to the UN inspectors, of failing to reveal sites where enrichment is taking place. There is a nuclear weapons program happening. They have very large stockpiles of enriched uranium, larger than any country that doesn't have a nuclear weapons program would ever need.
I mean, I would say that the question is really, how close was Iran to making a nuclear bomb? Netanyahu says, that they have the capability to make 9 already. But, that's not really borne out by what we're seeing from, even his own director of national intelligence told the Senate Intelligence Committee in March that American intelligence assessed that Iran was not actively pursuing a nuclear weapon. She did say that Iran's enriched uranium stockpile is at its highest levels and is unprecedented for a state without nuclear weapons. And then, we have Rafael Grossi, the head of the UN nuclear watchdog, who said Iran is not far. Could be, not far from having the capability of weaponizing its missile warheads. It could be a matter of months, not years. But really, the last declassified report from the UN watchdog said that it couldn't verify that Iran's nuclear program was exclusively civilian, but it did not say that Iran was on the verge of a nuclear weapon.
I think what some people found slightly jarring about Penny Wong's comments on Israel having the right to defend itself, even when it's not really borne out under international law, is that Wong and the government are consistently talking about the rules-based international order and the importance of observing it in the context of Taiwan and the South China Sea. But then when it comes to Israel and Iran, they're not standing up for the international rules-based order. What you see is really a pivot to kind of realpolitik, I guess, there.
Israel has made all these points about Iran's potential nuclear capability, but Israel does remain the region's only nuclear power, and outside of the UN's treaty to limit the spread of nuclear weapons. Should we be concerned about that?
Look, I think, as you say, Israel has always maintained a policy of strategic ambiguity when it comes to whether they have nuclear weapons or not. I think that analysts in the region would say Israel has had nuclear weapons for many decades. They haven't been used. They haven't threatened to use them. They've maintained their strategic ambiguity. I think the only other thing I would say about that comparison is that I think for some people it adds to this sense of hypocrisy around international law when there's, one standard for Iran and one standard for Israel, particularly in terms of self-defense and, adhering to nuclear treaties as well.
And in all of this, do you think that there is a growing sense that the West needs to diversify out of its dependence on the US? Is it a reliable partner?
I think, that allies of the US are starting to kind of wake up to the fact that, things are changing. Europe's increasing its defense spending. We've had lots of kind of shocks when it's come to Ukraine that have made people kind of wake up and think, we're not dealing with the same kind of America that we have traditionally dealt with. We've also seen Canada completely rethink its relationship with the US since Trump returned to the White House. And I think the situation is starting to change in Australia.
Look, I don't know how much it's changing, really. I think the Australian government's head is stuck firmly in the sand on this one. When Albanese and Miles have been asked about, for example, AUKUS, the huge, multi-billion, hundreds of billions of dollars are allocated to AUKUS over the next few decades. They've basically said there's no plan B. It's AUKUS or broke, really. And there's a growing chorus of defence analysts, of former prime ministers, Paul Keating, Malcolm Turnbull, who are saying that now is the time for a rethink, particularly after the Trump administration announced a snap review of the AUKUS program. But I think the questions about anchoring ourselves so firmly to an increasingly kind of chaotic and unreliable ally are broader than just AUKUS. And there have been defence analysts and a lot of people suggesting we need to overall, not just about AUKUS, but pursue a more independent defence policy within Australia.
Do you think there's also a risk of the international community losing sight of the starvation and bombardment happening in Gaza at the moment because of this crisis?
I think that's a really strong consideration, particularly because there's serious problems in Gaza at the moment, particularly in access to aid with this US Israel-backed aid program not particularly working very well.
Well, it's not aid either. It's only food.
It's only food, yeah.
And also, I think, this really came at a moment when Europe was starting to become really very vocal about the situation in Gaza and really trying to hold Israel to a level of, accountability that, we haven't seen yet. Just in the past few days, more than 100 Palestinians have died, after being targeted by the IDF at these food distribution centres.
And 10 days ago, that was the top headline in the world, and now it's not.
And I think it's a really good point, Bridie, to make that, we're still reporting on Gaza. We make a really kind of a concerted effort to do that, and we think it's really, really important. But you will see, that it isn't the top headline on most of the world's news bulletins at the moment.
Is there a way for this conflict to be resolved fairly quickly in the short term, do you think?
Well, there was a tiny, tiny sliver of potentially maybe good news today when we heard that the foreign ministers from the UK, Germany and France are going to meet with the foreign minister from Iran on Friday in Geneva. That actually hasn't been confirmed by Tehran, but if it is, it could signal some kind of diplomatic breakthrough. Before that, we've got David Lammy, the British Foreign Secretary, going to meet Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, to discuss the Middle East. So, there are some diplomatic avenues still available. Beyond those talks, beyond Friday, it is hard to see any off-ramps right now. Israel's pretty determined to press on and destroy Iran's nuclear capabilities. It would be much easier if the US got involved, but Israel there are other options for doing it without the US. And then I guess the question is, if we are looking at regime change, it's not really clear what comes next after that. It's dangerous and it's unpredictable. And I think the other thing we should note is that, if the talks do manage to get to a point where the missiles stop flying, Israel actually hasn't critically damaged Iran's heavily protected nuclear program. And this kind of action against Iran, could potentially, make the regime feel like it desperately needs nuclear weapons, even if that wasn't happening before.
And now it's time for what we can't get out of our heads this week. Patrick, what was that for you?
I was really taken with a chart which we published by data journalists Josh Nicholas and Nick Evershed. They call it One Big Chart, and it's a series, they look at different things. This week they looked at the emissions from Labor's extension of the North West Shelf project, and just how huge and massive the figure of 87.9 million tonnes of carbon dioxide is in context. Because sometimes these figures are thrown around and we know it's big, but we don't quite know how big it is. Just to put that into context, if you drove a car around Australia 125 times, that's equivalent to 500 tonnes of CO2. That's the smallest square on their chart. Keep on scrolling down. You'll see, for example, that we get about halfway down, the entire greenhouse gas emissions of Ireland are 57.6 million tonnes. We get a bit further down, and it's, all the emissions from Australian agriculture in a year is 79 million tonnes. And then you get to the end and it's Woodside's 87.9 million tonnes. So put in context, it is a massive, massive increase in Australia's emissions. And I think you need to look at the chart just to understand how big it is.
I know, it's extraordinary to see it visualised. And numbers can sometimes become meaningless when you go that big. Bonnie, what can't you get out of your head this week?
I think I speak for most of the country when I say that I've been really glued to the mushroom trial that's taking place. Everyone I speak to is similarly kind of interested in the story and wants to read everything they can read about it and listen to everything they can listen to about it. It's been several weeks in court now, and we're all kind of, it seems that the defence is doing its closing arguments at the moment, and we are in the process of a verdict coming at some point. So I feel like we're really kind of at peak mushroom.
Yes, it is a very sad and unusual case, and everybody I know is waiting for that verdict. Thank you so much for joining me this week.
Thanks, Bridie.
Thank you, Bridie.